This morning, we're going to be looking at some of the most famous words that Jesus ever said. So grab a Bible and let's turn to the Gospel according to St. Luke, chapter 15. In this chapter, we find one of Jesus' parables, a very well-known parable. And contemporarily, it's known as the parable of the prodigal son. This parable really gives us insight into a question: what does a good father look like? Today's Father's Day, and maybe some of us have a very different experience when it comes to having a father. Maybe some of us here had wonderful fathers. Maybe some of us here had not so wonderful fathers, and maybe some of us here never had a father at all. But Jesus in this parable is going to reveal to us the good Father, the one true good Father. This parable actually comes at the end of a series of parables, and I want us to first just get the context for the teaching as we look at verses 1 and 2 of Luke chapter 15. Then drew near unto him, that's Jesus, all the publicans and sinners, for to hear him. And the Pharisees and the scribes murmured, saying, This man receiveth sinners, and eateth with them. And he spake this parable unto them, saying. The context for the three parables that Jesus is going to give us in Luke chapter 15 is this. Jesus, in his ministry and preaching about the kingdom of heaven, was attracting a lot of sinners to himself. These were people that had a reputation of poor moral choices in their lives. These were the tax collectors who were stealing money from their fellow men. These were the prostitutes. These were people who had a reputation of wasting their life in a life of sin. And yet they were interested in the kingdom of heaven. They were coming down and they were talking to Jesus, and he was sitting down and having a meal with them. And the Pharisees and the scribes, the religious leaders of the day, were not impressed with Jesus sitting down with sinners. And so Jesus is going to give them three parables. And the parables all work together. The first parable is about a lost sheep. The second parable is about some lost coins. And the third parable is about some lost boys. The parable works the same way. Someone has something that's lost. They go through great lengths to find what was lost, and when they found what they lost, they rejoice. So that's the big picture here. And we're going to zoom in and focus in on the third parable that Jesus tells. We call it the parable of the prodigal son, but we could probably call it the parable of the lost boys and the good father. I want to read the whole parable, and then we'll go through it. Starting at verse 11. And he said, A certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. And he divided unto them his living. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance with riotous living. And when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in the land, and he began to be in want. And he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into the fields to feed swine. And he would have fain have filled his belly with the husks that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. And when he came to himself, he said, How many hired servants of my father's have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and will say unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. But when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him, and had compassion, and ran, and fell on his neck, and kissed him. And the son said unto his father, I have sinned against heaven, and in thy sight, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. But the father said to his servants, bring forth the best robe, and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring hither the fatted calf, and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead, and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to be merry. Now his elder son was in the field, and as he came and drew nigh to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said unto him, Thy brother has come, and thy father hath killed the fatted calf, because he hath received him safe and sound. And he was angry, and would not go in. Therefore came his father out, and entreated him. And he answering said to his father, Lo, these many years do I serve thee, neither transgressed I at any time thy commandment, and yet thou never gavest me a kid, that I might make merry with my friends. But as soon as this thy son was come, which hath devoured thy living with harlots, thou hast killed for him the fatted calf. And he said unto him, Son, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine. It was meet that we should make merry and be glad. For this thy brother was dead, and is alive again, and was lost, and is found. This parable is so deep and has so many realities about the kingdom of heaven that I'm just going to be able to scratch the surface this morning about what's going on in this parable. But I want us to focus on the father here. The parable starts out with a certain man had 2 sons. And so we're going to look at the character and the heart of the good father through his relationship with his sons. There's a really special thing about a relationship that a father has with a son. You see, God's plan for male character development looks like this. A young man is supposed to learn how to be a godly man through an older man called a father. This is how God intended it. This is how God passes on his wisdom to the next generation. In the book of Proverbs, wisdom and the wisdom of God is personified as this father who is giving advice to his son. And over 20 times in the book of Proverbs, you hear the words, my son, listen to this. My son, don't go there. My son, listen to my words. This is what the relationship between a father and a son is supposed to look like. And yet, in the second verse, we read something tragic that happens. This father was a wealthy man, a lot of land, a lot of livestock, a lot of servants. And his younger son comes up to him and basically says this to him: I wish you were dead. You see, he asked for his inheritance, and the inheritance would be something that came either right before or right after the father died. And so the younger son turns to his father and says, you have a lot of money, I want it, and I kind of wish you were dead. In a sense, this is exactly what the younger son is saying to his father. His father's not on his deathbed. Father can run. He's doing better than a lot of fathers we know, right? And yet, his son wants him dead. How would you feel? Maybe you'd feel a mix of emotions, but probably really angry, probably devastated, knife to the heart, total betrayal from your son. Maybe some of us would yell at our son if he did this to us. Maybe some of us would hit our son if they said this to us. What does the good father do? What does he say to his son who just stuck a knife in his heart? Wish you were dead. He says nothing. He says nothing. All that anger, and yet he says nothing. You see, the good father is slow to anger. In Ephesians chapter 6, we learn about some teaching about the relationship between a father and a son, and it says, and ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. The good father is slow to anger here. He exercises so much self-control, and he doesn't say anything to the son. He liquidates his assets, comes up with the money. And I just need us to see this morning. His son takes the money and walks away. I'm sure no hug goodbye. I'm sure no looking forward to seeing you again. He just takes the money and leaves. There's an incredible reality here. You see, this son had the best father you could ever ask for. There's no better father than the good father, and yet he went his own way. Fathers, our children aren't just our children. They're sons of Adam, and they're daughters of Eve. And the rebellion and the disobedience comes pre-installed. We don't have to teach them that. And we can be the best parents to them, and yet that rebellion at some point and at some time is going to rear its ugly head. And we need to be ready. And we need to be close to God so that we respond in a way like this good father. Slow to anger, doesn't say a word, and his son walks away. I want us to think a little bit about this son this morning. You see, he walks away from his father because he doesn't want to serve his father anymore. There's probably rules for the house, and there's obligations that come along with being a son. And I want to explore this a little bit in the difference and the similarities between being a son and being a servant. If we turn to the book of Galatians, chapter 4, we get some insight into this similarity and difference. Galatians chapter 4, verse 1 says, "Now I say that the heir, or the son, as long as he is a child, differeth nothing from a servant, though he be Lord of all, but is under tutors and governors until the time appointed of the Father." And so it works like this. The son lives under the father's roof, and the son works for the father. There's responsibilities that come along with being a son, and it looks a lot like the responsibilities that come with being a servant. A servant isn't different than a son when the son is young. The son has to work for the father and serve him and obey him and do the things that the father wants him to do. But at a certain time, the father would hand over the inheritance to the son. And now the son would be the boss. And now the son would take care of the land and the livestock and the possessions. But the son didn't want to live under his father's roof. He didn't want to serve his father. And so he thought, I'm going to live for myself. There's only one boss, and it's me. So he takes his father's money, and he goes off into a far country. If you took a Jew living in the time of Jesus, and you said, hey, I have this story about a father and a son, and the son leaves and goes on a long journey into a far country and wastes his life and comes back to the father, the Jew would say, oh, I know that story. That's the story of Israel. It's the story of the Exodus. It's the story of the captivity in Babylon. And so this young man goes the way that every young man goes. Rebellion to the father and trying to live life on his own. I'm not going to serve anyone. But an incredible thing happens. In one verse, the money is gone, and in the next verse, he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country. And he sent him into his fields to feed swine. You see, he left his father's house because he didn't want to serve his father, and yet 2 verses later, the money's gone, and he's working for someone. He's a servant. There's a Bob Dylan song called You Gotta Serve Somebody. And the chorus goes like this: it might be the devil, or it might be the Lord, but you gotta serve somebody. You see, this son learned the hard way that there's no such thing as a spiritual entrepreneur. you can't just live and serve nobody. Every one of us has to serve somebody. And in a short period of time, he went from serving his father to serving the devil, working in the field with the pigs. He was getting skinny, not enough food. He didn't even make enough money to buy himself some bread. He had a job, and he was working, but he was starving to death on the job site. This younger son has a moment of clarity as he's feeding the pigs, and as he's eyeing up the slop that the pigs are eating. He has this moment of clarity where he thinks about his life. And more than that, he thinks about back home. He has this moment, what do the young kids call it? Red pill moment, where he turns back and he thinks about his life before he left his father. And he comes to this realization that his father has servants. His father is a wealthy man, and he hires people to work for him. And his servants are never hungry. They always have enough food for themselves and their families, and they have some left over too. At home, under the service of the father, never hungry, always enough. But out on his own, serving this strange man, running out of food. You see, the reputation of the good father is this: he was a good father in the home as well as outside of the home. The thing that made him a good father, his generosity, his kindness, his goodness, wasn't restricted to the way that he treated his boys. It was flowing out into the way he treated those who were working for him. He was a good boss. You'd want to be working for the good father. And so the application in our own lives is this: are we good fathers outside the home and inside the home? Do people know that we love our children just based on the way that we treat other people and the people that we employ and we interact with every day? You see, he had this moment, the younger son, and he said, I'd rather be a servant in my father's house than a servant here for the strange man. And so he makes his journey back to the father. You see the love that the father has. This father loved him the day that he betrayed him. This father loved the younger son every single day. And you can almost sense that he was out in the fields, watching every day, praying, maybe today my son will come home. Maybe today I can welcome him back. And so the son comes back home. And when he was a far way off, the father sees him. He recognizes him. And he does something that's would be very strange to see in this culture and in this time. The father runs to meet his son. You see, the father was probably wearing sandals and like a robe. And so to run to meet your son, you'd have to hike up your robe and run across town. And elders in this society would never do something like that. But this father loves his son so much that he doesn't care what other people think. He's going to run to receive his lost son back to him again. And when he meets him, we understand what grace is all about. You see, the younger son repents, and he goes to his father, and he says, I've sinned against heaven and in thy sight, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. He doesn't even get to the part where he's like, I just want to be your hired servant, just let me work in the field. He doesn't even get there. He says, I'm sorry, I've sinned. And we see a lot of clarity in how this younger son is talking about his own life and his sin. You see, he doesn't sugarcoat what he did. He is brutally honest with his father. I've sinned against heaven, and I've sinned against you. And before even has a time to say, just make me a servant. The father says, get the ring, get the robe, and get the shoes. What is that all about? You see, a ring and a robe would be status symbols. And they would tell the community that this father would be living in and know very well that this is indeed the son of the Father. He was restored fully. That ring and that robe meant that he was going to get the inheritance, that he was 100% a son of the Father. No exceptions. He was fully restored. This is what makes the Father's heart rejoice. This is what gives him great joy, to embrace a lost son, to bring him back into the family, to give him status again, to take the shame away, to forgive the sins. This is what makes the Father so glad. And when he calls his servants, he says something just incredible. I don't know if you caught it. He says, "This my son was dead and is alive again." See, in the heart of the Father, his son had died and had resurrected. His son was born again. And if you want one theme to read the entire Bible through with in mind, it's this theme. You were dead, but you're alive again because of the grace and the goodness of the Father. Fathers, what makes us happy? What makes us glad? Is it that our kids have the best jobs? They went to the best school? They married the best spouse? Is that what makes us glad? Or is what makes us glad this, that our children know that they are children of God because they've been born again? It's a beautiful moment when we welcome our children into the world, but it's even more beautiful when our children are born again. And that's what gets the Father happy. That's what makes him glad. My son was dead, but he's alive again. And so he throws a party. He kills an animal and makes a barbecue for the whole neighborhood, invites everyone in. This was my son. He was dead. He's alive again. He was lost. Now he's found. Sounds a lot like a baptism service if you think about it. The whole community knows this was my son. He died out there when he left home, but he came back to life when he came back to the Father. The older brother doesn't get a lot of airtime, and that would probably make him angry just thinking about that. But I want us to think a little bit about this older brother. We meet him coming in from the field. And so he's working for the father. He didn't leave. He didn't take his inheritance. He stayed on the farm, and he kept working. And he hears the music and the laughing and the dancing, and he pulls the servant aside and says, "What's going on here?" And when the servant tells the story about his lost brother who's found, the older brother gets angry. And if we look at the words of the older brother in verses 28 and 29, we can see that the older brother is caught in a life of self-righteousness. And he was angry and would not go in. Therefore came his father out and entreated him, and he answering said to his father, "Lo, these many years do I serve thee, neither transgress I at any time thy commandment. And yet thou never gavest me a kid that I might make merry with my friends. These many years I've worked for you, I've served you, I've obeyed you." And he says this to his father as he makes a massive scene outside the party that the whole community is invited to. He's walking in from the field, and he's pouting. He's angry. And when he hears about his younger son, his younger brother, rather, he's disgusted. And so he makes a scene. And he argues with his father in public. In this day, that would be absolutely shameful. You would never argue with your father in public, but he's going to take this moment to say, Father, you've been holding out on me. I've done all these things for you. You're not good. You never celebrated with me. You've been holding out on me. We see something else here. The older brother has a big problem with the younger brother. There's division in the family. And as the older brother's making this scene, as he's bringing shame to his father, the older brother rehearses in the father's ear what the younger son did. And he fills in the blanks, if you will, about what the activities of the younger brother were. This guy, he destroyed your money with prostitutes, and you're going to let him back in? As if the father didn't know what the younger son did to him. He's just going to stick it to him one more time. So there's division in the family. The older brother hates the younger brother. What's the father's response to all of this? You see, the older brother is just as lost as the younger brother was. And although he's working on dad's farm, and as in his own words, he's following the commandments, the older brother is just as lost as the younger brother because his heart is so far away from the father's heart. The father wants to rejoice, and the older brother's angry. He's furious. Close to the father, but in his heart, very far away. You see, the older brother in the story is the scribes and the Pharisees. And Jesus is aiming this story at them. You're the older brothers. I'm accepting the sinners, and you should be rejoicing with me. And yet you're angry, making a scene. The reality of division in the family is not a one-off coincidence here. This is the reality of every family. And the good father, you can just see him holding his arms out to the older son. Come back home. Everything I have is yours. You're my son. Rejoice with me. Your younger brother was dead. He's alive again. Come back home. I want us to consider a couple things this morning. Adam, the first father, had two sons. There was an older son. His name was Cain. And there was a younger son. His name was Abel. Cain killed Abel because his own works were evil and his brothers were righteous. Abraham had two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. And they're killing each other today. Isaac had two sons. The older son, Esau. Younger son, Jacob. Jacob steals and swindles his brother out of the birthright. And his mother comes to Jacob and says, leave because your brother's angry. He wants to kill you. Jacob has 12 sons. But he loves the younger son more. And one day, the older sons were done with this younger son named Joseph. So they throw him in a pit, and they sell him into slavery. Division in the family is what post-Genesis 3 parenting is all about. It runs through the whole story of the Bible. And the parable of the prodigal son kind of leaves us on a cliffhanger. What's going to happen? Is the older son going to come back in? Is he going to be embraced by the father? Is the family going to be healed? What's going to happen? You see, the good father has a third son. We can call him the only begotten Son. And the heart of the only begotten Son is so aligned with the Father. It's so the same heart that if you've seen the only begotten Son, you've seen the Father. Because the third son is the one that's telling the parable. The only begotten Son goes to Jerusalem, and the older brother meets him there. And the older brother kills the only begotten son. And as he's being nailed to a cross, he's got his arms stretched out. He embraces the younger brother. Forgiveness, salvation. And he turns to the older brother. And he says, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. The only begotten Son heals the family. I want to close with some verses from Ephesians chapter 2. It's all about the third son, and it's all about the idea of death and resurrection and how the third son healed the family. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 14. For he is our peace, that's Christ, who hath made both one, and hath broken down the middle wall of partition between us, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances, for to make in himself of twain, of two, one new man, so making peace, and that he might reconcile both unto God in one body by the cross, having slain the enmity thereby, and came and preached peace to you which were afar off, younger brother, and to them that were nigh, older brother. For through him we both have access by one Spirit to the Father. If you're lost today, the Father's arms are open wide. He wants you to come back home. And the hands of the only begotten Son have nails in them, because that's what he went through to forgive you. So come to the Father through Jesus the Son and give him the glory, great things he hath done.